Okay. All right. Thank you for the invitation. So we're here to discuss basically the 150th anniversary of this book, Capital, Das Kapital, by Karl Marx. It was published in 1867. And let me perhaps start by saying that although it's been 150 years since the publication of this book, there still appears to be some interest in Marx. You can see that, for example, if you go to the movie theaters today, there is actually a movie running on the young Karl Marx, which is actually, I think, illustrative of the interest in Marx. Also, if you go on YouTube, there's this course by a very famous Marxist professor, so to speak, called David Harvey, and he teaches a course in which he reads Capital, the book, chapter by chapter. And, for example, his course has over 500,000 views, which is, I think, pretty amazing for such a specialized issue. Also, I mean, you can refer to the book of Thomas Piketty, which you perhaps know, the famous book on inequality that was actually a bestseller 2 years ago, and where Thomas Piketty, who is not a Marxist, but he named his book Capital in the 21st Century, which was a clear reference to Marx. And so actually he tried to connect to Marx in his, let's say, his marketing. Also, perhaps as a final reference to Marx in our present time, I would like to refer to the recent elections in Britain. A couple of months ago we had elections, you may have followed that, where basically Jeremy Corbyn saw a big increase, big rise during the election campaign. In the end he just did not win, but during the election campaign, basically Jeremy Corbyn was accused of being a Marxist by the right-wing party, by the Conservative Party in Britain, and they say, what do you think about Marx? And the press was asking him, and he said, I think Karl Marx was great, I think there's much to be learned from Capital, he said. And obviously the Conservative Party attacked Jeremy Corbyn. But the interesting thing is, I have here an article from The Economist, you may know the Economist magazine. They basically published an article then on this issue, and they said, literally, this is the title, "Labour is right, so Corbyn is right. Karl Marx has a lot to teach to today's politicians." So basically The Economist, who is not a Marxist a magazine, not at all, but they basically say, there's an enormous amount to learn from Marx. They write, indeed, much of what Marx said seems to become more relevant by the day. That's basically what they say. And they say, the conservatives should think twice before they dismiss these ideas of Karl Marx. All right. So let me tell you something about the context in which this book was written and how it came about. First of all, if you look at the title of the book, it's called Capital, and the subtitle of the book is called A Critique of Political Economy. Now, political economy was actually, at the time in the 19th century, was how the economic science was referred to. So basically, a critique of political economy basically means it's a criticism of the economic sciences. It's a criticism of how the economists in the time of Marx looked at the economy. So he wanted to criticize the economists, the mainstream economists, basically. Also, capital, what he actually means is the capitalist system. All right, that's basically what he means by the title of the book. So that's what the book is about. It's about the capitalist system, and it's supposed to be a criticism of how the mainstream economists, or the bourgeois economists, like as he called them, see this. You should also keep in mind that Marx was not really an academic. He was not a professor at the university. He did a PhD in philosophy at some point in 1840s. He then tried to get an academic position at the university, but he, as well as the so-called left Hegelians, so a group of, let's say, atheists and more left-wing, let's say, thinkers, were basically thrown out of the universities, and they were not allowed to become professors at these universities. So basically they were blocked out. And so the only option was to start working on his own. And he continued to do that during his life. He continued to write. He lived actually to a large extent in poverty with his family, and he was supported by people like Friedrich Engels, who supported him with money and apparently with wine and other things, so, as we've been discussing. So anyway, Also very important, I think, to realize is that's not often mentioned, especially not at universities, that Marx obviously was a politician. I mean, he was an activist. He was a political militant, if you like. I mean, Marx, I'd like to give you just one example, in 1864, constructed and led what is called the First International, which is basically a political party, a political organization, if you like, that is organized worldwide, to which workers can join from every country in the world, and that had a program to change the world, basically. And he set it up. He tried to bring people around the table and tried to develop it, and speech, and wrote a lot of things. And basically the book, Capital, was actually meant as a sort of a theoretical foundation, also an intellectual foundation for the movement he was building. Okay? So I think that's very important to keep in mind, that Marx was a political activist, and he writes as a political activist, and it's not simply a product of the university, so to speak. The book is, I think, in the first place, it's a theoretical book in the sense that it brings in new concepts, and it creates a theory. It posits a way to view and to analyze capitalism. So in that sense, it's a theoretical book. But if you go through the book, you will see that it's also very empirical. I mean, it's full of figures, full of numbers about, say, the health conditions of the working class, about mortality, about wages, about profits and things like that. So it's this is often, especially in philosophy courses, you may get the impression that Karl Marx was a very vague and obscure writer, but actually it's not correct. I mean, he actually was also had a very empirical aspect also to his writings. Capital was also the product of, let's say, around 10 years of research. He started it in 1857, and he set up to write a big work of critique of political economy. And he, just to give you an idea, I mean, 2 years after that, he had a whole collection of notebooks, which he didn't publish at the time, but which are now published. You can actually find them in bookshops, which is called the Grundrisse, and that's actually a collection of notebooks by Marx that are partly actually were integrated later on into Capital. Also, that was actually early, that was in 57. In 59, actually 2 years later, he published a small book which is called A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which he published, and which basically later on was included as the first part into Capital. All right. Then 2 years after that, he had a sort of a draft manuscript for Capital. 2 years after that, he had a new draft manuscript, which you can now all find online. I mean, you can actually follow the development of his work by looking at the various drafts he created for the book. So, I mean, the thing you need to keep in mind is that Marx was a bit of a perfectionist, I think. All right, so he was never really happy. He kept rewriting, and he wanted to include everything. He was reading, he was thinking, he was, so in the end, after 10 years, in 67, he published this, and it was called Volume 1. Volume 1. More were to follow. He had at least 4 volumes in mind, and unfortunately, actually, Marx died before he finished everything that he wanted to do. So the volumes 2 and 3 of Capital were published based on the manuscript and the drafts he had in his drawer, basically, published by Friedrich Engels, who published them. And there's also actually a sort of a 4th volume of which is basically about the history of economic thought on profit and surplus value and things like that, which was later on published also by Kautsky. So it's a part of a broader project. And actually, if you look at the archives with the collected writings of Marx and Engels, which are only very recently are becoming available now, if you look at these archives, what you see is that, first of all, he was reading a lot of the works that were being published in his time, also the works of, let's say, the mainstream economists. He wasn't afraid to read the works of his opponents, and actually to take over ideas from his opponents. I will give you examples in just a minute. He also, at some instances, he actually came back on earlier ideas. I mean, he wasn't, if he came to new insights or he was criticized, he actually made small changes. So it's possible on some issues, some very specific issues, to find, let's say, contradictions. Apparent contradictions in Marx's work, in the sense that he writes something in 1857 and then he writes something else in 1867 or later, all right, which is simply, I mean, it's perfectly understandable because Marx is also a scientist who, has an open mind and develops his thinking, and but that's I think also important to see that he had that attitude towards analysis and towards of course, I mean, on the fundamental features of capitalism, he kept his views. I mean, Marx was and always has been, of course, an anti-capitalist, and I mean, on the broad things, broad and essential features, he was consistent. Okay, let me tell you something about the attitudes and how people react to this book. First of all, we're meeting at a university. It is my impression that very often at universities, the Capital and the works of Karl Marx are either silenced to some extent, so they're not discussed, or they're often also made turned into a caricature, into a straw man. To give you just 2 examples. In my own field, I'm a labor economist, so I basically work around labor economists are interested in how the labor market works, in how, let's say, the number of workers that want to work in an economy, the number of workers, how does unemployment arise, how do wages, why are wages what they are and not higher or lower, how do trade unions affect wages, things like that. Now, if you know anything about this book, about Capital, you know that all the issues I just mentioned about labor economics are basically, to some extent, discussed by Marx in Capital. And so it's actually astonishing to see that if you take a standard textbook of labor economics today, there will not be a single reference to the work of Marx, not a single one. All right, so it's complete silence, I would say. So that's one example, I would say, of the silencing of Marx. An example of making strawmans, the example I would like to give is an example of the time I was a student here. Actually, I was a student in economics, and I had a course in sociology by a professor who I respect in a great number of ways, Professor Ricardo, but who was discussing Marx, I think, in a very bad way. He actually portrayed Marx in his book and in his teachings, in his classes, as an economic determinist, saying, in the eyes of Marx, the superstructure is completely determined by material conditions, and therefore that's clearly nonsense, and therefore that's absurd. And so it gives it clearly suggests that Marx was inaccurate, at least. All right. And for example, in the textbook he wrote, actually, Michael Hagis, he immediately jumps also to Weber, who then had a theory of the way religion and Protestantism actually played a role in the development of capitalism, with the implicit message that Weber had a more balanced view of how society works, because Weber does have a view on how the superstructure can actually also determine the material basis of society, and that was clearly more correct than what Marx was saying, the economic determinist. Okay, now I think that's absurd, to be honest. Okay, it's completely wrong, and Marx was accused of economic determinism during his life, and he responded to it. And there's works, for example, in the Anti-Düring, where he himself also deals with this issue, and he says that it's completely ridiculous. I mean, he's not. Just to give you one example, he was a politician. He was a political militant. If he really believed that the development of history was an automatic thing, he would not be involved in constructing the first international. Okay, he was actively trying to change the world. You don't do that if you believe that history proceeds in an automatic way. Now, there's other people who reject Marx on the grounds that Marx is associated with dictatorships, like, I don't know, Stalinism in Russia. Okay, it's indeed true that Stalin called himself a Marxist, of course, and he called himself a socialist. But I think we should always keep in mind that it's not because you call yourself a socialist that you are a socialist. I mean, the Democratic Republic of the Congo calls itself democratic, but that in itself does not say anything about the level of democracy in the Congo, of course. Okay, so I think this is a topic in itself, but I think the USSR was not socialist; it was Stalinist after a certain point in time. And I wouldn't draw too great conclusions from that. Also, I should note that those people who say we cannot seriously take Marx because he's associated with dictatorships, if they are consistent, they should stop teaching neoclassical economics. What is being taught in every economics department. Why? Because neoclassical economics was embraced by dictators like General Pinochet in Chile, was embraced by Suharto in Indonesia, etc. I mean, you can make the same point. So if you're consistent, you should abolish neoclassical economics at the universities. Perhaps a final thing on attitudes toward Marx is that in some circles, at some points in history, in some left-wing sects, I would call them, there is also a tendency to treat Marx as a prophet, right? To treat Marx not as a scientist but as a prophet, and to treat basically the works of Marx as somewhat of a Bible, in which every sentence should be taken literally. Okay, I think that's a problem as well. Just to explain you my own attitude towards a work like Capital, or towards a writer like Marx, I compare it a little bit with Darwin. I call myself a Darwinist. We can have a debate, but because I fundamentally agree with the theory, with the central theory of evolution from Darwin. So basically, if there's people who attack Darwin, I will enter the debate and I will more or less defend the Darwinist position. Do I agree with everything that Darwin ever wrote or said? No, not at all. Okay, the book you're reading, Reason in Revolt, which is an excellent book, actually criticizes Darwin on a number of issues, because Darwin was not a dialectical thinker. Okay, he was a very gradualist thinker, and there's some errors of that. Who nowadays we have a better view. I think biologists have a better view than in the time of Darwin. So you can criticize Darwin on a number of points, and the same I think can be said about Marx. I mean, I would defend Marx on the central lines of his argument. That's why I call myself a Marxist. But that doesn't imply that I would agree with every single line or anything. Okay, so I think we should have a supportive but a critical and a distant approach. Okay, something about, a little bit more about the book itself, and let me tell you something about the sources of inspiration where Marx based his analysis on. Because the book is not, I'm an economist, so I tend to look at this book also from the angle of economics, but the book is also read by historians, by sociologists, by philosophers, by geographers, by a great number of people, by political activists, of course, in the first place. And let me perhaps phrase or cite Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist who founded the Italian Communist Party. He once summarized Capital saying, Marx equals, to use a mathematical formula, Marx equals Hegel plus Ricardo. That's the way he summarized Marx. It's Hegel plus Ricardo. What does he mean by that? Well, this Ricardo, David Ricardo, was actually one of the main economists of the time. So one of these political economists of the time, who wrote in the early 19th century and who developed many theories, economic theories, also on trade, but basically a whole framework of analyzing the economy in terms of, for example, he had what they call a labor theory of value. So he tried to understand, why is one product has one product, like a bottle of water, a higher value than another product? Well, Ricardo argued because essentially there's more labor in this than there is in this bottle of water. Okay, and it's essentially the amount of labor that is embodied in commodities, in products, that determines the value. And Marx actually takes over that idea. Although he doesn't agree with Ricardo, for him Ricardo is a bourgeois economist who basically defends capitalism, but he takes on these ideas. However, he also goes one step further, and he says, okay, once you start analyzing it, it's true that basically everything contains labor. However, in capitalism, what you see is in capitalism, labor itself, or said more correctly, labor itself is being sold, and Marx makes a very important distinction from that point. He says, what is being sold under capitalism is not labor, but it's labor power. Okay, so basically labor power, by that Marx means it's the capacity to work, the capacity to do work. You sell your capacity to do work, and then the capitalist who hires you and who buys the labor power lets you work in the factory and actually extracts more labor from that worker than he pays back in the form of a wage. And that was Marx's famous theory of surplus value, which he develops at length in Capital. And basically the theory of exploitation, of how workers actually perform more labor than they are returned to in the form of a wage. So he takes over actually a lot of ideas from the earlier economists, also from the mainstream economists, also from Adam Smith, by the way, Quenet, things like that. In passing, let me say a word about these liberal economists, because like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, today they are the heroes of the Liberal Party in Belgium here, the VLD, which is the right-wing Liberal Party who defend basically the interests of the employers here in Belgium. They always say our ideologue is Adam Smith, and actually I think if Adam Smith were alive today, he would reject it. He would not want to be associated with people like the VLD here in Belgium, not at all, because actually there is something progressive in Adam Smith just to situate where they are in history. Before Adam Smith, the economic thinkers basically argued that, think of Thomas Hobbes, who argued that if you leave society to its own, basically people will tend to smash each other's heads, all right? And that's why we basically need a feudal king to create order, all right? That was basically the philosophy of the time. And people like Adam Smith went against that and argued that no. It's, you can leave society on its own. We don't need your kings, okay, for the order. Laissez faire, laissez passer, le monde va de lui-même. All right, so just let it happen. Things will be okay, and which is actually a very progressive message compared to the previous feudal system, of course. So, on the other hand, Marx also criticized the view because Adam Smith obviously said that if you leave society on its own, then the self-interest of all the people in the society will create the best of the possible worlds. And Marx said, no. As the capitalism develops, that's getting more difficult by the time. I mean, for example, as capitalism develops and you get a crisis, in the middle of a crisis, any individual capitalist will have an interest not to invest, but that's actually what makes the crisis go on. That's actually what prevents the crisis from ending. So what you see there is that the people acting in a self-interested way are actually blocking further progress in society. So Marx had a more balanced view of that, but obviously he saw the progressiveness in the ideas of people like Smith and Ricardo. And just for the anecdote, I mean, people like Adam Smith, I mean, he constantly attacks the employers. He considers them a class that should be rejected, okay? So which is completely unlike the liberals and the Macron and the VLD people you see today. For example, Smith also says that you can have on migration, for example. Smith has the position that it's completely wrong to oppose anyone, to move from one place to the other in search of happiness and in search of, to improve your life. I mean, that's completely against liberalism for Smith. But all the the so-called liberal parties in Europe today, I mean, they are creating, they're creating walls, basically, essentially around Europe. Okay, so that's political economy. The second source of inspiration for Marx was this Hegel. Okay, Hegel was a philosopher who developed a method, so-called the dialectical method, of which this book is supposed to be the Reason in Revolt is the English original edition, is basically a sort of update on dialectical philosophy in modern science. Okay, it's like an actualization of the dialectical method. Now, basically, the dialectics of Hegel, the philosophy comes down to the idea that every system, if you analyze it, first of all, changes. All right, you have to understand the system in its movement. You cannot understand it statically. You have to understand where it comes from, where it is going, and you have to understand that very often systems develop by taking qualitative leaps. In a jumpy way, not in a gradual way. All right, in a revolutionary way, if you like. And you have to understand that revolutionary change by looking at the inner contradictions of systems, and that goes for the development of thought, or the development of societies, or the development of species, or that was basically the philosophy of change of Hegel. And obviously Marx takes over that idea, and just to give you two examples of that, which can be found in Capital. This is actually full of Hegelian thought. First of all, one of the central messages of Capital is that capitalism is a historic system. It's not a natural not a natural and like a system that has always been there and that will always be there. I mean, Marx conceptualizes capitalism as sort of a stage, if you like. I mean, there were other systems before it. There's going to be other systems after it. And he writes also in the introduction of Capital, he writes, the present society is not a fixed crystal. You know, it's it is changing continuously in a development process, just like an organism. I mean, he had just read, by the way, Darwin, who had just published his The Origin of Species, was just published in 1859, and he actually very much tried to analyze the economy in very similar terms as Darwin. He was much inspired by Darwin, I would say. Another idea that is very Hegelian is the idea of revolutionary change in Marx. Right? I have a lengthy citation here, but I have it in Dutch. I'm going to summarize it to some exchange in English. It's very famous, so you may know it, because he says that people basically enter certain relations, that are outside their will, and those are the production relations in society, basically. And at a certain level of development in society, basically the forces, the productive forces, basically what an economy is capable of producing, they start contradicting the present relations of production and the present property relations, he says. From then on, basically the productive relations, they become a fetter, like an obstacle to further progress in society, and that's when, he says, then enters the era of social revolution. So you see there the idea that a system, in this case the economic system, basically goes from one state, let's say, to another in a revolutionary way. So it's not in gradual change, but you have revolutionary change, which is an idea he picks up from Hegel. Perhaps this is also a good moment to say something about whether you should read the book. When I mentioned Hegel, because Hegel is a very obscure writer, I should say, a very difficult one. So, okay, and to be honest, I mean, there's a very, I advise you to actually have a look on YouTube later on, and to look at a sketch by Rowan Atkinson. Rowan Atkinson, Marxists, you should look it up. It's a very small sketch, 40 seconds, and it's about basically a group of revolutionaries, like students or like activists, who are in the 70s, they're together, and they all have their copy of Capital, right? And they sit around the table, and they say, okay, we're going to, comrades, we're going to study Capital, they say, okay. And so the president of the meeting starts reading. You can actually follow it if you have Capital, because it's the first sentences of Capital that he starts reading, and then it gets horribly complicated, so it's like this very obscure language, and then Rowan Atkinson, if you know him, is a very funny guy, he starts looking like this, like, oh my god, what is this? Like, and then the president keeps reading, and then suddenly he says, "Oh, fuck, let's go kill somebody." He says. Okay. So it's like, okay. He said that summarizes also a bit of the idea, or let's say the idea many people have about this book. All right, it's too obscure, it's too difficult, and to be honest, to some extent, there is some truth in it, because the first part of the book, let's say the first 100 pages out of 700. Is actually very Hegelian. It was written actually in a time where Marx was very much occupied with Hegel, and I think it contrasts to a large extent with let's say the rest of the book, which is much more empirical, which is much more accessible, I would say, and perfectly. I mean, I'm not saying the first part is incomprehensible, but I often say to people, you can perfectly start at the second part, after skip the first 100 pages, read the rest, and then at the end, you read the first part. I think it's possible. Some people will say, hey, that's impossible, you break the unity of the book, and okay, whatever. I think that's possible. I think that's possible. One final thing on reading the book. There is this David Harvey that I mentioned in the beginning. He actually goes a step further, because according to David Harvey, this book is not just something you should read in order to understand the world, but it's also a great literary experience. He says it's a great book, it's a page turner. He loves the book. And he says it's such a great book because, all of these references to philosophers, all of the references to Shakespeare, to all these writers, to all these, also he speaks about the structure of the book. And it's true, there's some truth in it. Yeah. If you look at the structure of the book, the first chapter is called in Dutch de waar, it's called the commodity in English. And basically he starts literally from a kilogram of wheat, kilogram tarwe. And he basically, so he starts from a product, any product, he zooms into that, he says, we're going to analyze that product, and from there he starts saying, okay, there's labor into that, and there's like, okay, the surplus value, and then he starts, well, you have capitalism, and then you have the development of capital, and basically he constructs like a whole theory of the development of capitalism, but by first starting and by zooming in on like this product, which is stylistically a very nice thing to do. I mean, if you ever write a paper or a book, you often wonder how to structure something. Well, this is actually quite a great way of structuring a book. I would agree. Okay, so it's in some ways you can read it as a great literary work as well. Okay, let me say something about also the main topics in the book, and they're, I think, pretty famous. So Marx says in the introduction, literally, the aim of this book is to show or to describe, let's say, the development laws of the economy. That's how he writes in the introduction. So he's very clear about what the aim is. The development laws of the economy, by that he means, how does capitalism develop, right, basically. And I think probably the most well-known idea associated to capital is probably the theory of crisis. It's very well associated with Marx. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, when the economic crisis of 2008 entered, the Financial Times had a headline saying Marx was right, which illustrates the fact that Marx is still very much associated with the idea that he has a theory of crisis, right? Whereas the other economists do not. I can talk for a long time about this issue, and it's true. I mean, the other economists, every time they say that crises are a thing of the past, they're never going to happen again. Some economists have a theory of how you can combat crisis, like John Maynard Keynes. They have a theory like that. But Keynes doesn't really have a theory on how crises come about. Marx does. Marx explains how a crisis can happen, which basically corresponds to Keynes, but he also explains how crises are actually inevitable. They are part of capitalist development. Okay, we can actually discuss it afterwards in the discussion if you like, to some more detail. Another law of development, so another feature of capitalism that Marx sees is the so-called centralization of capital, and by that he means the tendency towards companies producing at ever greater scales. You have companies that become bigger and bigger and bigger, right? That have larger market shares also, and that actually tends to eliminate competition in the market. Competition which was at the source of the dynamics in capitalism. All right? So as capitalism develops, what you see is that the source of the dynamics of the system are basically killed. So capitalism is killing its own preconditions, if you like. All right? So that's a very, very powerful idea. It was later developed to a large extent by Lenin and emphasized, but Marx cites it. And I think, by the way, if you look at history, because Marx wrote this, you should keep in mind, in the 1860s, at a time when basically scale was still pretty limited. But if you look at history, the economic history since Marx, this has been greatly confirmed. I mean, decade by decade, you see that the scales of production are increasing, and the size of companies are becoming bigger, and that market shares of companies become bigger, and that you have tendencies towards monopolies, and it was Marx who described. There's a lot of other issues. Perhaps we can discuss them in the discussion, like the tendency towards greater inequality, which was, I think, confirmed, which was hypothesized by Marx, and which was, I think, greatly confirmed by the work of Thomas Piketty, who has collected a lot of data, basically, that confirms the idea that under capitalism, the basic tendency is towards greater inequality. There's other things, perhaps one final aspect. The book, to a large extent, is also about working times. I think that was working times and the reduction of working time, of the working day. At the time, basically, in the 1850s, I mean, people had the 12-hour working day, all right? And over the decades of Marx's life, basically, there was a fight, there was a struggle towards reduction of the number of hours people work per day to 11 and 10 hours of working time per day. And so he discusses this as length. I mean, think about it. His theory of surplus value is essentially that, capitalists pay a worker to work for the day, And then what the capitalist tries to do is to let you work as long as possible during that day. Because the longer you work, given your daily wage, the more you're going to produce for this capitalist. All right. So it provides kind of like a theoretical framework for workers at that time to understand the fight they were fighting. Okay. And for example, he cites strikes of workers who protest against capitalists that give fines because they arrive late at their work, okay, or things like that. So it's actually very much about working times as well, right? And I think it's an issue that's still very relevant today. Okay, let me start summing up and concluding. I would say that capitalism, obviously we're 150 years later, capitalism in many aspects, in many concrete aspects is very different than it was in the time of Marx. But I believe that the essential features or the essential hypotheses of Marx have been confirmed. I think if you look at present-day economies, the central feature of any economy is the struggle between labor and capital. All right, it still remains a valid framework of looking at economies today, and it's a feature that is, I think at universities undervalued. All right, I think by academic economists they refuse to see it, whereas in practice it's a very important and central feature of economics, labor and capital. Also, I mean, the development of inequality, as I told you in the work of Piketty, it confirms the works of Marx. The recurrence of economic crisis, it's a confirmation of Marx. The development of monopoly power of big companies, the development of globalization, which is a topic I didn't talk about, but Marx describes it actually. I mean, all these central hypotheses, I believe, are correct and are confirmed, and so that's why I think that capital is actually a bit of it's a tremendous work that belongs in a library next to the works of Galileo and Newton and Darwin, and I mean it's actually a work of this of that standard, I would say. But it's also, as I hope I explained, it's also a work written by a political activist that criticizes the economic sciences, that criticizes the idea that the economy is a natural thing that cannot be changed. Right? So it's a critique also. It's a guide to action, because as the leaflet that you may have got, the flyer for today's activity, it said very well, in order to change the world, we have to understand the world. Okay, and I believe that was what Marx tried to do. He tried to explain how capitalism works in order to change it. And I believe that the ongoing questioning of capitalism, the search for other economic systems, that is basically the reason why Marx continues to be read today and continues to be popular in many groups of activists. Thank you.